Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce Jacqui Wilkinson. And Jacqui lectures in religious education in DCU in the Institute of Education, and she's based in the Church of Ireland Centre, where she's coordinator for the Church of Ireland Religious Education Certificate for students. And Jacqui is a very experienced teacher and educator with many years of experience in the classroom and in third level context lecturing. She's an academic with great expertise in policy and practice in education in Ireland. Jacqui holds a Bachelor of Education degree from Trinity College, and when she was there as an undergraduate, she was elected as a scholar. She holds a Master's in Literature, and she also completed a Master's in Arts in Warwick University on Religions and Education. She's currently completing her Ph.D. at Warwick University, and she's working with the distinguished Professor Leslie Francis. For those of us involved in religious education and religion and education at primary level in Ireland, Jacqui is absolutely no stranger. She is the distinguished editor and author of 8 books in the very successful Follow Me series. This is the RE primary programme taught in Church of Ireland, Methodist, Presbyterian and Society of Friends schools all over Ireland. So she's known to so many of the children in schools as well. So she's carrying out really exciting work. And one of her areas of interest is on school ethos and on the spiritual development of children. And we're really delighted to have her with us today to talk about a fabulous topic, children and prayer. Over to you, Jacqui, and you're so welcome to the Irish Institute.
Well, thank you very much, Trish. I sort of feel you must be talking about somebody else and not me there, but I hope that what I'm going to share with you this afternoon will be of interest. It is going to be partly what I'm studying for my PhD. It's a little bit of sort of side angle on what I've studied, and it's looking at, as Trish said, prayer and children. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an attempt now to share my screen with you. I don't know whether you can still see me when it is running, but we'll see where we go. And hopefully you can still see me, but otherwise you can listen for a little while and just relax. So my topic for today is children and prayer, and it's looking, as I said, at Church of Ireland primary schools. So in a Church of Ireland primary school, a typical 9 to 12-year-old student attends school assembly on average once a week and participates in religious education lessons 2 or 3 times a week. Prayer is a planned component of each assembly and lesson. Students then experiences prayer and praying in the school setting well over 100 times in the course of the school year. Depending on the school setting, some students would have many more school-based experiences of prayer. With more frequent school assemblies, I found that 28% of primary schools have assembly more than once a week, or more regular religious education lessons. In that 7% of schools have RE every day, with 53% more than once a week. And prayers can be said at other times during the school day as well. In this paper, I'm going to show you that empirical research has repeatedly concluded that the home is the primary influence on student religiosity and religious practices. However, if this is true, and prayer is a key part of the school day, then the school also needs to consider what influence it can have in supporting the students' experiences of and attitudes towards prayer. The paper commences by exploring the literature surrounding home influences on young people and prayer. I'll look at some research studies in what actually is a very limited field of study. It's then going to present the findings of my own research, an empirical study based in the senior classes of Church of Ireland primary schools in 2019, where I investigated the prayer practices of over 3,000 young people and explored the factors which may impact on these practices. And I'm going to conclude by reflecting for a little bit on the role of schools in supporting students who pray. The image of the child kneeling by the bed saying her or his prayers is frequently seen in art and literature. stretching from a sense that prayers at bedtime could be considered a safeguard from nighttime dangers. One commonly found prayer in prayer collections and simple searches for bedtime prayers for children is the old one, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." This prayer was sometimes seen combined with the Black Paternoster, one version of which is Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, "Bless the bed that I lie on, 4 corners to my bed, 4 angels round my head, 1 to watch and 1 to pray, and 2 to bear my soul away." Now, very strange sounding prayers nowadays, and of course they must be read in terms of the theology of the day and the social context of the high levels of childhood mortality. But actually my research has shown that in 2019, it was at bedtime that most 9 to 12-year-old children said that they prayed. This research has a focus on the prayer practices of young people between the ages of 9 and 12 who attend Church of Ireland primary schools in the Republic of Ireland. And as I mentioned already, it fits into a small group of studies on prayer within the lives of primary school children, which have emerged since the start of the 21st century. Published qualitative studies have focused on prayer as a positive attitude for primary children, the awareness of connections between positive emotion and prayer and negative emotion and prayer among 4 to 8-year-old children, the psychological and spiritual significance of children's prayers from prayer books left in the chapel of a children's hospital, and the contribution of prayers in shaping literacy within a Catholic primary school. Quantitative research studies have largely been found to focus on the factors that impact on prayer frequency amongst young people. Francis, Apshon, Lancashire and Eccles have researched the impact of personal factors, that's sex and age, psychological factors in terms of personality, religious practices in terms of church attendance, and home influences in terms of parental church attendance and conversations about prayer on the child's frequency of personal prayer. And they concluded that the home had the greatest impact on the student's frequency of prayer, and most strongly the discussion of prayer with the mother. One further study linked prayer frequency with spiritual well-being, demonstrating that students who pray more frequently also show higher levels of spiritual well-being. But what's interesting when we think about the Ireland of today and society of today, it's been found that even those students who identify as non-religious will inevitably encounter prayer in a church school. Research by Shillito and Strachan has shown that despite common concerns about indoctrination and isolation of non-religious students, that they, quote, did not experience tensions between praying to God and their non-religious identities. Through studies, the researchers found that some children were indifferent and actively rejected times of prayer, while other children created their own moments of spirituality. But of course, there's no one response to or experience of prayer, either in the religious student or in the non-religious student. And this is highlighted in that article by Shillito and Strachan, who stated that prayer for children is religiously and non-religiously diverse. And when we're thinking about that, we need to reflect this, taking account of how children engage with these categories. So as I move to discuss now the possible home influences on a student's experience of praying, we must remember the actual, expected and diversity in each individual student's prayer experience. So one size is not going to fit all, and I'm always very wary about generalising, but I'm just giving you a sense, I hope, of the research that's around this whole area of the influences on the student's prayer. To think a little bit now about the transmission of values through prayers at home. The first reference there to Voas and Watt, they warned about the national decline of religiosity and religious affiliation amongst young people in the UK. They suggested that institutional religion had a half-life of 1 generation. As they said, that the generation then in middle age has produced children who are only half as likely as they to attend church, to identify themselves as belonging to a denomination, or to say that belief is important to them. Voas, the same author, also coined the phrase, which I love, which is fuzzy fidelity. And he would refer that to a cohort of people with a casual loyalty to religious affiliation. in that they may be only nominally affiliated to a religion, maybe tick it on a census box, but maybe have less connectivity to regular religious practices such as church attendance or prayer. So if we have this sense of, transmission declining, where is it based then? So research has shown that the parents' religiosity is the primary influence on the religiosity of their children. So Myers and Bengtsson, Putney and Harris, they conducted interviews with adult offspring to assess the transmission of religiosity from one generation to the next. And they looked at this across a number of generations. Myers concluded that the variables which aid the transmission of religiosity are the parents' religiosity, the quality of the family relationship, and the traditional family structure. They noted that experiences in adolescence and early adulthood would have some effects on religious behaviour, but that it actually didn't diminish the transmission of religiosity. So a huge amount of evidence that what goes on when a child is young in the home has its impact going forward. Bengtsson, Putney and Harris, they drew up a model of intergenerational religious momentum, and they centred their findings from research on the influences of the family and showed evidence of the importance of parental warmth in successful transmission. They then broadened that home influence factor wider and discussed the increasing relevance of grandparents in the transmission of religious values, coining the phrase generational stake, with the older generation investing time and treasure in younger generations, and suggesting that in fact grandparents might be increasingly more directly involved than parents in the religious socialization of young people. This could be through substituting for parents who have no religious affiliation, reinforcing and enhancing the parents' religious influence, challenging or subverting the parents' influence, or just not getting involved at all in the religious socialization of their grandchildren. Although researchers have referenced the influence of the parents in the transmission of religiosity, Smith and Denton concluded that the parent was indeed the most significant influence on their child's religious and spiritual life. And Francis and Brown noted that parental influence present in childhood measurably decreased as the child developed through adolescence into adulthood. Although Bengtsson, Putney and Harris highlighted high boundary religious groups and noted the highest rate of transmission of religious faith was in Mormon families and in evangelical Christian families, but they also showed that a family without religious affiliation was very effective at transmitting this to the next generation. And back to Strachan and Shillitoe, they also referred to the transmission of non-religious identities, calling them the stickiness of no religion as compared to Christianity. They quoted findings from Woodhead, who stated there was a 45% chance of those raised as Christian ending up as non-religious, compared with 95% of those raised as non-religious ending up as non-religious. The full responsibility for the transmission of religious identities can't be solely restricted to the home. And this is really the nux of and the beginnings of where my argument takes place. Because when a student encounters a religious practice in school, it has to impact on them and elicit a response. And Strachan and Shillitoe has showed that schools and the child's own reflections also had a measurable impact on the child's formation as non-religious. They suggested this was due to opportunities for students to consider their identity through religious education and by the possibilities of engaging with those of religious outlook and none. And Bengtsson, Putney and Harris, back to them again, but they also acknowledged that school and church could have influence on the young people's religious practices and beliefs. Not saying that they're the most important, they still would say that the home is the most important, but that the school and the church could either reinforce or detract from this intergenerational religious momentum. So what are we doing in school? Does the religious identity and religious practices formed at home affect? Is it supported by effective and positive practices in school? Are there opportunities in well-taught religious education for the student to reflect on her or his attitudes towards religious practices such as prayer? Personal prayer and church attendance are actually religious practices that we can measure in terms of frequency. And studying as I do under an expert in quantitative research, That's kind of where I ended up looking, because we can actually establish whether children attend church and whether they pray by themselves through their own words. There has been little published research about the prayer practices of young people, particularly primary school, which is my focus. However, there have been some key studies looking at religious attendance. And Francis and Gibson have demonstrated that parents actually have more influence over church attendance than they do over more private practices, such as personal prayer. So I'm going to look really quickly at church attendance before grounding my thinking into this personal prayer field. Practically speaking, if we think of a primary school age child, we're looking at 9 to 12-year-olds, they would tend to attend church along with one parent or both parents. In fact, Kay and Francis have described church attendance as a behaviour which, like shopping or going on holiday, affects the pattern of life in the home, a pattern which is especially relevant to the child if it involves being taken to church. As the child gets older, he or she may have more choice in church attendance, but for the children being focused on in this research study, parental church attendance would at least affect the family life, and that tends to be most likely on a Sunday. Bengtson, Putney and Harris demonstrated that parent-child similarities in church attendance were at their highest at both ends of the attendance spectrum. So in other words, either when the parents attended frequently, like weekly, or when they never attended. So this implies children model themselves on the behaviour of their parents. They also commented that if the parents are not themselves involved in religious activities, if their actions are not consistent with what they preach, the children are rarely motivated to follow in their parents' religious footsteps. And again, within the Anglican church school context, research by Francis, Lancashire, Eccles and McKenna demonstrated that young Anglicans who attended church primarily did so because their parents attended church. Francis and Gibson found that mothers' church attendance was more powerful on the children's church attendance in the 11 to 12-year-old age group, but noted that the father's influence was stronger on sons than on daughters in this age group. Kay and Francis concluded that on the brink of the teenage years, the support of the father within the church-going home is important if the son's religious socialisation is to go smoothly. In an Australian report, Francis, Penny and Powell found that frequent attendance among young churchgoers occurred when both parents attended as well. They also found, and I'm really not surprised about this, that young churchgoers responded better to parental encouragement rather than direction or pressure to go to church. Francis, Lancashire, Eccles and McKenna, researching amongst young Anglicans attending church schools in England and Wales, found that strong and significant correlations were reported between students' church attendance and both mothers' church attendance and fathers' church attendance, but that influence was greatest when both parents attended church. So we can conclude that church attendance is impacted on by parental church attendance and the home. But of course that could be primarily because it is, like I mentioned at the beginning, like shopping or holidays, it is a family activity. Another research question that has been covered by some researchers is whether conversations with parents and others have an influence on the students' public and private religious practices. And looking again at Francis, Lancashire, Eccles and McKenna, they've researched the conversations that students have at home with their families about God, Jesus, prayer and church, and found that the practice of family prayer times, the encouragement of a personal devotional life for children, and parents simply being able to and prepared to talk with their children about faith all lead to higher levels of belief and a more positive attitude towards and involvement in church life. I mean, in ways that's really easy to expect. If you're going to talk about things at home, it's part of the family life. And this has also been found in the second line there, Francis, Penny and Powell. Again, the most positive attitude towards church was found amongst young churchgoers who had the opportunity to talk about God with their parents. Francis and Craig were looking at 10 to 12-year-olds in 2006, and they coined the phrase that they were the tweenagers. And they said that the maintenance of a positive attitude towards church during those years, again, was associated with having parents who support the faith, not just in example, but also in conversation at home.
The Lancashire Index of Religious Conversation survey was administered in primary schools as part of a Church in Wales 3-year research project, measuring religious conversations at home. They concluded that students were most likely to talk to their mother about religious topics, 30% talking to their mothers, but it was with their teachers in that research that most religious conversations were found to take place. So Lancashire commented, and it's a reminder to where we're thinking today, that we need good religious education, because religious conversations may not take place for every student at home. So whereas the home is vital, the school maybe has a role in supporting that. Research discussed in this article has not specifically looked at the factors that influence a student's personal prayer frequency, and the study at the bottom of that page is the foundational study which has influenced a lot of my own work. Francis Apshon, Lancashire and Eccles looked at the factors which may impact on student prayer frequency among 9 to 11-year-olds in Church in Wales primary schools. And when they're looking at church prayer frequency, we've looked at church attendance, we've looked at conversations, but they have also found that the strongest factor in shaping prayer frequency was religious conversation at home with the mother. And do you remember we talked about the study which talked about grandparents? Second place was actually the conversation with grandparents. So this implies that prayer practices, as well as church attendance, as well as conversations, are transmitted intergenerationally. And remember, the influence now of the mother in shaping prayer frequency is most significant. Parental church attendance was also found to be a predictor of prayer frequency. Again, that's kind of the practical, the going to church, the active and overt religious practices having an impact on the more private practices. Francis Apshon, Lancashire and Eccles also found that girls were more likely to pray than boys, and they found a significant link with the student's personality. So a student who demonstrated highly extroversion scores, so where an extrovert is more likely to engage in conversation, they're also more likely to pray. Also more highly emotional scores. So looking there at where the more anxious students might look for support, maybe looking for support from God and that whole sense of personality. But also finding students lower tough-mindedness scores, again another facet of personality, implying that tender-minded students be more likely to value religion. So tying in not just to the child and everything that they get from home, but also to their own personality. So that's the introduction, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of my own findings, very early stage findings. But what I did, as I mentioned at the start, was a survey went out to 93 Church of Ireland schools, and pupils from 4th, 5th and 6th classes completed the survey. So I ended up with a lovely total, which this time last year you would have found me sitting in SPSS putting in endless results. 3,249 surveys were put into data and analysed. So I had pretty much even numbers between girls and boys. What did I ask in the survey? And you're only getting a small snippet of it today. But I looked at things like religious affiliation, that's your church attendance. And if they say that they belong to a particular religious grouping. We looked at personal prayer, which I'm going to show you the results for that in a minute. Personality, again, I looked at those facets of personality that I mentioned in the previous study there. I looked at that question of family discussion about prayer. Are the children talking about prayer with mothers, with fathers, with grandmothers and grandfathers? I actually left out the conversation about conversations with teachers because students are doing in those schools are doing RE in schools, so it was going to be a tick that they would all have conversations about RE topics in school. So to try and keep the questionnaire as short as possible, we didn't look at if they talked to teachers about prayer. And then I obviously collected the essential personal factors, their age and whether they're male or female. So here's some results for you now. So this first table answers that question as to how often the child prays, the student prays when they're on their own. So you can see there that 14% said that they prayed every day. Pretty much similar results for boys and girls. So you're looking at over a quarter of the students praying at least once a week. And you're looking at 34%, over a third of the students saying that they never prayed. And that goes up to 40% for boys. I did further statistical analysis and found that yes, there was a statistically significant difference between boys and girls, and that boys do pray less frequently than girls. I also looked at the same question across the different age groups. I found there was a little dip between 4th and 5th class, but not the same dip between 5th and 6th class. So there seems to be, and it's something any of us who are teachers realise, that big gap between 4th class and the top 2 classes in primary school, where the students then were statistically praying that little bit less by themselves. So when did they pray? On that slide I showed you at the very start of this, looking at the child praying beside the bed. Yes, they're mostly praying when they go to bed and when they can't sleep. So there is that still sense of prayers at bedtime, with 74% of the students locating their personal prayer time at that time of the day. The next question I asked is, what are you praying? And of course, these answers are all the students who said that they did pray. So you're looking at, some of the cohort obviously didn't pray at all. So the students that did pray, 59% made up their own prayer, and very small percentages using prayers that they already knew. To do some more consideration of the factors that are affecting the personal prayer life of students, I looked at the church attendance. And you can see there that weekly attendance reported by 19% of the students. The students said that 17% of their mothers attended and 14% of their fathers. But then looking down at the bottom, 24% of students would never attend church, with 17% of their mothers and 40% of their fathers. So they're not getting that practical experience of prayer in church. And then, if you remember some of the studies I've showed you already, does that impact on them not praying at home or not having the same attitudes to praying at home as those who would attend church weekly? What conversations are taking place at home? I found that 13% of the students said that they talked about prayer with their grandfather. And then you're moving up to 17% with their father, 21% with their mother, and with their grandmother, and 20% with their mother. So you can see how important both the mother and the grandmother are in conversations about prayer. Again, maybe not that surprising, but it's still something that's worth considering. So then I got really stuck into analysing and finding out, it's all very well saying this is what happens, but I needed to find out that why. So what have I found out? Yes, that prayer frequency does have that significant association with sex in that girls record at a higher level than boys. A small significant effective age, I've mentioned that already. In terms of personality, just like in the study in Wales, I found a significant link with personality, where students who demonstrated higher extroversion scores, lower anxiety scores, and lower tough-mindedness scores were found to pray more frequently. You can see that the lower anxiety is different from the Welsh study, but it's actually very, very close to zero. It's only barely significant. In terms of church attendance, just like again in the Wales study, I discovered very strong and significant correlations between personal prayer frequency and the students' church attendance, the mother's church attendance and the father's church attendance, where higher levels of personal prayer were reported by those who attended church themselves, whose mother attended church and whose father attended church. In terms of family conversations about prayer, I discovered that significant correlations were found with conversation of prayer with both mothers, fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, but particularly, and here's the correlation shows it slightly differently, particularly with the mothers, augmented by that with the fathers. So conversation at home really does impact on the student's frequency of prayer. Then, having engaged multiple regression, I brought it down to the fact that personality, yes, is a factor. Church attendance is a factor. The mother's church attendance is a factor. They're all really important, but it's actually that conversation seems to be the most important factor that impacts on a child's personal prayer life. It's conversation with mothers, and particularly that, and then augmented by that of the father. So this leads me to a few conclusions before we end up today. First of all, is obviously what I've mentioned the whole way through, and it ties in with the research, that the strongest factor in shaping prayer frequency in 9 to 12-year-olds is the home, and particularly conversation with parents. Again, that church attendance is a significant factor in shaping prayer frequency in 9 to 12-year-olds, primarily their own attendance, but also that of the mother and the father. Again, that girls are more likely to engage in personal prayer than boys. So what are we doing with the boys when we're thinking about prayer at home? And obviously that dip between 4th class and 5th and 6th class. And then the whys, I don't have answers to why student prayer takes place when going to bed or unable to sleep, and why prayers are mostly self-composed rather than prayers that may be said at home or in church or in other contexts. So they're the main findings. Wearing my teacher hat, I need to think a little bit about what are we doing in school. It was stated at the start of this paper that students in Church of Ireland schools frequently encounter prayer. The school then has a key role in supporting prayer practices amongst children. It was noted that only 3% of students prayed a prayer from school when they prayed alone. So schools can help supporting students in creating prayers and can help them explore prayers for personal use. As conversation about has been found to be a significant factor in strengthening prayer amongst young people, intelligent conversation about prayer in school can also be of effect, particularly, as we mentioned earlier, when religious conversation may not happen at home. This also reflects the view of Bengston, Putney and Harris, who stated that some influences from school can reinforce or detract from the impact of the home in transmission of religious affiliation and practices. Schools can therefore take several steps to ensure that positive and effective teaching about prayer, as well as genuine experiences of prayer, are encountered in the course of the school day. Firstly, that when prayer is conducted in school, that this is in a respectful manner, with a sense of worship. This can be done through silence, focal points, the feeling of prayer being planned, a sense of expectation, and even stillness. Secondly, that a wide variety of styles of prayers are in use, including prayers composed by students. This skill will enable the student to pray alone at other times. Thirdly, that specific RE lessons are devised which teach about prayer, so that students understand its place in Christianity, and the conversation in the lessons allows for questioning and exploration of the place of prayer in the Christian life. And fourthly, that non-religious students may encounter prayer on their own terms and may elect to remain silent or to avoid the experience as meets their needs, but that they too are encouraged to learn about and respect the place of prayer in the lives of those with a religious faith. So although the home is regarded as the key influence on a young person's prayer practices, the role of the school and the prayer practices experienced there cannot be underestimated as factors which impact positively or negatively on the students' experiences of and attitudes towards praying themselves. So that is the end of my presentation. So I don't know whether Trish wants to